So there are around 30 uncommitted delegates at the DNC, but they have not been given a speaking slot. You brought this up earlier, Moya. Yesterday evening, they staged a sit-in. It was they were asking simply to have a chance to address the convention and to share the experience of Palestinian Americans. They were denied, but parents of an Israeli hostage were given a speaking slot, sparking, of course, as you can imagine, huge backlash. Harris also received backlash a couple weeks ago for her response to pro-Palestinian protesters at a rally in Michigan. I want to play a little bit of what she said.
You know what? If you want Donald Trump to win, then say that. Otherwise, I'm speaking.
I got to hear from all three of you. How did that response sit with you? You first, Natalie.
Not great. I do understand this is politics, but I was actually outside of the convention last night talking to a lot of the uncommitted people protesting, and they were told they couldn't wear their Palestinian flag. They were told one of the delegates from Iowa security tried to take him out, and it's particularly disturbing because you're just denying their identity, like the fact that they are still alive, that they're Palestinian and they're somehow still around is offensive, does not sit right with my spirit, and it shouldn't sit right with the Democratic Party.
Moya?
I agree. I think the Democrats have said and made a claim about being a big tent, and to exclude Palestinians from that tent is really alarming, especially given the kind of violence that we're seeing in Gaza and now the West Bank. There needs to be a real account for this, and there hasn't been anything close to that in what the Democratic leadership has offered.
Nitasha?
Yeah, I don't think that response was okay. And I think it really reveals that despite all the celebrations of Kamala Harris as a first, as we were talking about, there are limitations placed upon and taken up by anyone in that office. So she's the commander, and she will be, if she gets elected, she will be the commander-in-chief of all branches of the U.S. military. And that means that she would be responsible, as every president is. And so, at Northwestern University in the spring, we were part of the news cycle in terms of the encampments that were taking place across the country. There's going to be similar movements in the fall, likely some clashes. And I think that it's really critical for her to give space to not just both sides, but to really analyze what the responsibility is of the commander-in-chief of U.S. imperialism abroad. What is our responsibility? And this sort of, I'm speaking as a Jewish person, this tie between Israel and the United States, it really needs to be unclenched, and Palestinians absolutely need to be given a voice. But more so, it's about the broader policy of U.S. militarism, and maybe we'll talk about this in the later part of the show. But I know that the economy is really important to U.S. People in the United States. I would love for people to just do a Google search of how much the U.S. spends on its military. Right. And why freedom is like the theme of this convention. What are all of these ties together, and what gets kind of dropped out of that conversation?
I wonder if I could pick up on that.
Yeah.
I do think that there's something really important about looking at that financial piece. How do we actually get to a conversation about how many of our tax dollars actually end up going to fund a lifestyle, a world that we allegedly want here? What does it mean for people to have access to healthcare in Israel that we don't have access to here? So how do we get people to start thinking about where their tax money is going and how these issues are connected?
At the same time, on Tuesday night at the DNC, Michelle Obama warned Democrats about being overly critical about Harris's positions. Here's what she said.
The minute something goes wrong, the minute a lie takes hold, folks, we cannot start wringing our hands. We cannot get a Goldilocks complex about whether everything is just right.
So there are different standards, Natalie, that are placed upon women of color in national leadership positions, especially. How do you see this impacting the country's evaluation of Harris?
That was a perfect clip to play, because I think that Michelle Obama raised such an important point These are all, I mean, at this point, she's the vice president. So she's not, so, I mean, we can't totally, she's not 100%, like the ball it doesn't stop with her. The buck doesn't stop with her necessarily. And so I tend to give a little bit of grace. And, what I try to think about, in terms of our research, what we know about intersectionality, what we know about, experience the world as a Black woman and those, twin axes of oppression, that helps you see things in a certain way. And what we know about Kamala is that she is she roots for the underdog. She's really for, so it is my hope that the Uncommitted movement and all of the people who've been advocating for peace in the Middle East and a real just solution that they will prevail, and that she will use, if she gets the opportunity, she will use that pulpit in a way that's different. She will govern different.
Yeah. These high stakes, they also raise questions about, like, what kind of politician does a woman of color have to be to gain such a wide party support, Moya?
I mean, it's interesting. We were talking about this a little bit before, that
You've got to be perfect.
She has, and she also has pulled in people from the other side. There are also Republicans who are defecting and saying that they're in support of Kamala. And so for me, that raises other questions, too, about what is it about her and her positioning that makes her acceptable for people who otherwise wouldn't see her as a viable candidate. So I'm really hoping, as you said, that we can get to a place where her and her administration, if elected, can make room for the dissenting voices, because I do think that is actually what's going to push her to be more of a leader that we can actually respect, and somebody who can be in a position to make the kind of changes that we need to see, given the context of a terrible position in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, I want to stick with you, Moya, because I want you to speak to voters for a second. Because how do you recommend they critique Harris for her record and her policy positions, but also field off those offensive, racist, and sexist comments?
I think it's pretty easy. So my gauge for misogynoir is if it's about appearance, if it's about somebody's behavior, if it's not really about her political record, her political resume, then it's not relevant to the conversation. What we should be looking at is how she is moving, and can she be moved? I do think that we've seen some evidence of this. I think picking walls was definitely a part of that. I do think that the choice of walls, to me, signaled some movement in terms of how she is thinking and calculating who does she actually want to represent, what can these dissenting voices actually, where can she be pushed? And so I think it's really important for those folks to stay loud and to continue to keep moving things a bit more to the left, because I think, unfortunately, we've moved very much to the right. The center has moved to the right so much in the last couple of years.
I want to bring back up something that you mentioned earlier, Natalie, about the ways in which Black women form the base of the Democratic Party, right? 93% of Black women voted for Joe Biden compared to 6% for Trump. But many say that true representation is making sure that the issues that matter most are what is being fought for in the Oval Office. So what would you like to see Kamala Harris prioritize?
Well, I think that the situation in the Middle East I think it's a very high priority. This is a moral question of our time, and we are able, and young people are understanding it. The students who I work with, at AU understand it. Around the country, we're having an awakening around these issues where we have a space to have conversations that weren't possible before. And so I'm hoping that moves forward. I do think that, so far in her track record, she does have a track record of sort of speaking to the issues that are Black women are disproportionately, impacted by. And I hope that sort of I would hope that would continue. But going back to the politics thing and this Goldilocks phenomenon that Michelle Obama was talking about, when coalitions are very diverse, they're very fragile. And so, like, any one thing, like, she's on a tightrope, a little bit of a tightrope. Any one thing can sort of like topple things over. So it's a really difficult difficult place that she's in. And it is my hope that, I think that the uncommitted, everybody's doing their job. Like, this is the work of democracy. You're supposed to stay loud. You're supposed to, make sure that these issues come to the forefront. So that's where I think we're going to go.
Yeah.
I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful.
Nitasha, you're not so sure that her identities are coming into play in her policies, are you?
Yeah, no, not so much. I mean, I'm trying to think about, these various ways we can think about her background, her story, her ancestry on the one hand, and her policies on the other. And whereas I don't think they're completely disconnected, I think her mother's story, her father's story, the fact that she's been to India and she's been to Jamaica, she lived in Canada, I think that makes her a global citizen. It makes her very aware about immigration. Jamaica and India, it makes her aware of British colonization and being raised in the Bay Area. I think she was very familiar with sort of the political consciousness that was really informing her mom and herself. But that said, I don't think that means that we can then assume that she's like a radical or a very progressive person. Mm-hmm. So again, it goes back to what are her policies. That said, I do think that, we do need to allow her to understand that her policies and her take on issues have likely changed over time, as many of ours do, right, as we grow over time. So we can't take a policy that she or a decision that she made, in the 90s or 2000s as representing who she is right now. I do think that anyone who holds the office of such power, whether it's vice president, but particularly president, absolutely needs to be held to criticism.
Yes.
There is no doubt, because we are responsible, as I was talking about, for so much havoc abroad, and that is the way that the United States works. One thing that I do want to say, though, in terms of thinking about voters, there is, and her multiraciality, if you don't mind if I can say that quickly. Sure. On the one hand, from the right, folks, are trying to have it two ways. They're trying to say, like, she's the DEI candidate, referencing, the fact that she's a Black woman. On the other hand, she's South Asian, and South Asians are considered model minorities, high income earners, very highly educated, and not DEI candidates. So, when Trump says, Kamala Harris decided to be Black, it really shows that a real kind of strategic, insincere kind of calling upon the notion of multiracial people as having split or suspicious loyalties. What I would say, and I think that Michelle Obama was talking about this in a bit, is that there's a way that Kamala Harris can draw upon her story to appeal to various segments of the U.S.
Right.
that are divided along the lines of race and other things. Mm-hmm. That said, her policies have to be, as Moya said, for the betterment of the most oppressed and the most vulnerable.
Speaking of Michelle Obama, people have questioned whether the country's ready to elect a woman of color as president. Here is Michelle warning Democrats about giving in to these kinds of comments.
We cannot indulge our anxieties about whether this country will elect someone like Kamala instead of doing everything we can to get someone like Kamala elected.
So, Natalie, I know you resonated with the speech. Earlier, we mentioned that Zoom call of 90,000 Black women. Since then, we talked about the affinity groups, the white dudes, the South Asians, Black men that have all sort of been working across intersecting identities to try to make something happen for Kamala Harris. It can be messy trying to do that, but it can also be fruitful. And I know yesterday morning, Natalie, you were at a meeting at the DNC for women of color. So briefly, just give us the takeaways you got from that event.
Yeah, it was a kickoff for a new PAC called American Anthem, and it was led by South Asian women, but they also had the women who organized the white women for Kamala Call, and you had youth organizers that were there, and it was an absolutely beautiful experience of unity, intersectional unity. And, that's the word that, the academics, we like to talk about, those of us who have these intersecting identities, but we're calling on a space where we're sort of like coming together, and there's so much excitement and energy and sort of love. And one of the things that they talked about was that, first I mentioned the Win for Black Women and how much, like, decades of organizing went into that. And they talked specifically about how when the next affinity group came, they called the Black women and said, hey, how'd you do this? What do we do? And then the South Asian for Kamala group, one of the organizers of American Anthem, was one of the organizers of that call. She said the white dudes called her and said, hey, well, what do we do? So it's like we're kind of getting it to a point where I just think it's fantastic to sort of think about these affinity groups as opportunities, and we're leaning into our identity. We talk about this in terms of culture wars. Like, these are all opportunities, and and when you're somebody who like Kamala, who has multiple identities, multiple blended family, she has a lot of different things that she's sort of pulling on. I'm seeing how these things can actually be strengths.
Yeah.
And so, and even where we're talking about the misogyny among some Black men, who unfortunately get platformed. There are also the Black men for Kamala too.
Right.
So
there's a lot of groups.
So I just think that it really just reflects the opportunity that we have and that we're seeing. And then one of the key things that we talked about during this meeting was that this feeling that we're feeling, don't let it stop.
Yeah.
No matter what happens in November, don't let it stop. Don't stop organizing across identity groups. Don't stop leaning into who we are, and leaning into the political process.
You're right. And so I'm just about out of time, but I want to flag that tonight we're going to hear from the woman herself, Kamala Harris, right? So she'll be speaking. She'll be addressing a crowd tonight. I just have seconds left. I'd love to hear just 10 words or less. What do you want to hear from her tonight, Nitasha?
I mean, I would like to hear her responsibility that would be, that would happen as Commander-in-Chief, and the linking of these material issues of our defense budget and how that is linked to houselessness, the cost of groceries, and immigration policy.
You want to hear about the spending. Moya.
I want to hear about how we're actually showing up for our Palestinian brothers and sisters in this moment. The other affinity group, Muslim Women for Kamala, actually disbanded. So I'm really interested to see how she's going to take that information forward.
And Natalie, real quick.
I just want to see her. And I want to see the energy that I felt last night when I was in the convention center. I just want to see her. I can't even tell you what I want to see. I'm so happy to be at this point in history to be able to just witness this.
We've been speaking with Natalie Hopkinson, who's Associate Professor of Media, Democracy, and Society at American University, Moya Bailey, who's a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern, and Nitasha Sharma, who's Professor of Asian American Studies and Black Studies at Northwestern as well. Thank you all so much.